Should transgender women be allowed to compete in women's sports? This is the question I'm going to answer today. And if you haven't thought about it already, I want you to think about a second what your answer to that question is. One thing I find interesting, because I've had a lot of conversations about this topic, is that many times people make it seem so simple. And I'm sure some of you right now are probably yelling at me, "It is simple, Shannon." And people will say like, "Oh, it's just this one thing." Like, as long as this one thing is the reason for my yes or no, just this one thing. The thing is, all those people that tell me it's just one thing, there are different one things. Some people say it's the testosterone. Some people say it's the XY chromosome. Some people say it's the puberty. Some people say it's the muscle mass. Just one thing. And they make it seem so simple. And I wish it were that simple, but it's not. We can see that it's not that simple because even if you look at the world sports organizations and their own regulations on transgender athletes, there's no one way they do it. There's no one thing. Some sports like rugby say no transgender women. And other sports like World Aquatics say transgender women can compete if they transitioned prior to 12 years old. And then there are other organizations that say transgender women can compete as long as they suppress their testosterone levels. And then, even there, at what level they must suppress their testosterone levels varies from sport to sport. And then the other thing that varies, not just at what level it has to be suppressed to, but for how long 12 months, 24 months, 36 months. It varies sport to sport. So even looking at just the elite sports, there's not one answer. And it makes sense if you think about it, because we lack so much information. We may understand that there are some advantages. I think most people agree that testosterone gives some amount of advantage, although I would say that's still unclear. We know that males and we know that females have a difference in performance in some sports, but we don't know why. We know there may be advantages to testosterone, but we don't exactly understand what or how much. We haven't studied the levels of testosterone in elite athletes and how it compares to their performance. There is a recent study on testosterone levels among elite athletes between different sports, and among men, the levels vary tremendously from sport to sport. And same with women. So there's so much we don't understand about what are the advantages? What creates the advantages? And as I mentioned in the last podcast, which I strongly recommend if you haven't listened to, go back and listen to, it's all about fairness, where I talk about many of the things that people bring up in regards to fairness. But one of the things I mentioned that I must mention here is we haven't defined what makes something an unfair advantage. How much advantage is too much of an advantage? Inherently, sports have different advantages and disadvantages within them. But at what level does it become, quote, too much? For this week, I will answer the question, should transgender women athletes be allowed to compete in women's sports? But before I give you that answer, I want to do a brief history of transgender athletes in the Olympics. And then I want to talk about what I see the three problems in our current system and this current question are. I'm going to give you the solutions to those three problems, and then I'm going to give you my answer. So if you want to know what my answer is, listen until the end. But before I go into all that, I want to ask you if one of these things sounds like you. If you are a person that believes in inclusion, however, you get uncomfortable when people start talking about inclusion in sports because you're not exactly sure how to be inclusive and how to be fair, then this episode is for you. You want to listen to this one. If you are a person that likes nuanced conversations about gender, that want to expand your understanding and your learning and are curious by these nuanced conversations, this episode is for you. And finally, my fellow healthcare providers, as always, every episode I do has you in mind because Many of you are looked to answer the question, what is fair in athletics? And many of you have told me that you feel uncomfortable being asked that question. You're not quite sure. You have hunches, but you don't know what the research is. You don't have a complete understanding. And also, you may have patients that you want to support in their endeavors in sports, and you want more information. This episode is for you. So let's get started. When we look at transgender athletes in the Olympics, this isn't going to take very long because the truth of the matter is the Olympics did not create any sort of regulation for transgender athletes to compete until 2003, and that was called the Stockholm Consensus. And even though that was created in 2003, we do not see a transgender athlete until 2020 in the Paralympics. 2020 was the first transgender man to compete for trials, but we don't see a transgender woman, because that's what this question is about, in the Olympics until 2021. So from 2003 to 2021, I'm not going to go into all the details, but you can look them up. And I highly recommend transathlete.com to look. There's a great timeline of the Olympics and the policies and what the policies were and how they've changed. But as of 2021, the regulation was transgender men can compete without restriction. Transgender women, this was created in 2015, so it took 6 years. Transgender women could compete if they declared their gender as a woman and could not change it for 4 years of sports competition, that they maintain a testosterone level below 10 nanomoles per liter for at least 12 months, with some option to make it longer depending on committee decision and the sport, as well as that level of suppression had to be maintained throughout eligibility and competition, and that any form of noncompliance would lead to a 12-month suspension from competing. So that was the regulation before the 2021 Olympics in Tokyo. And in that Olympics, we had one transgender woman compete. That was Laurel Hubbard. She was a New Zealand weightlifter. Unfortunately, she did not medal. She was unable to complete a lift, but she was our only transgender woman competing. I will say there was another transgender woman on an Olympic team, and that was Chelsea Wolfe. She was on the US BMX team as an alternate. She did not end up competing in the Olympics. In 2024, we had no transgender women compete in the Olympics, and the main reason for that is that the regulations had changed. The Olympics decided instead of using the regulations they had, they would leave it up to the international organizations to determine who could compete under the category of women. So out of all the history of Olympics, we have one transgender woman to compete in the Olympics. But if we look beyond the Olympics, there are maybe a couple other athletes, people like Leah Thomas, a swimmer from a Division I NCAA team. There is Renee Richards playing tennis. So there are only a few transgender athletes that we have seen competing at higher levels, but I'd even argue the NCAA is not at the level of elite athlete, considering that only 2% of all NCAA Division I athletes will become professional athletes. So we don't have a lot of data. We don't have a lot of history. So let's get into the problems that there are when we're trying to answer this question. Should transgender women be allowed to compete in the women's category in sports? The first problem is we don't have a clear definition. If you just look in the comments when this is discussed, you will see that some people are talking about biological characteristics. Some people are talking about gender and biological characteristics, just like, as I was mentioning, all the ways international organizations put eligibility for transgender athletes. They vary too in whether they're looking at biological characteristics, gender identity, a combination of the two. So too do the definitions when people talk about it. So when we talk about women, That's a gender identity. But we say, no, 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 no. We're talking about sex, biological sex. And somebody's what somebody's assigned at birth. But that's not what we're using in many sports because there are women who are assigned female at birth who may have XY chromosomes, who may have higher levels of testosterone. Those women have what's categorized in the Olympics as DSD, or differences in sexual differentiation, and what some people may call intersex. But they were assigned female at birth. And I said, but we'll see, but the chromosomes, the hormones, that's male. But then if we look at what kind of advantage does testosterone give, that is unclear. We don't have the data and the research to know exactly what advantages, how much advantages, and does testosterone within intersex women have the same effect as it does in males? We don't know. So for me, the bottom line of this problem is we haven't clearly defined the categories. We have kind of used a generic term, men, women. These are generic terms that are representing some advantage that we haven't clearly defined. So instead of using a generic term, we're not qualifying what the advantage is. And I do have a solution, which I'll talk about at the end. The second problem, which this relates to, is fairness. People say this all the time. And again, listen to last week's episode. I go into much greater depth of it. But what I would say about fairness, when I think about fairness in sports, we're not talking about an issue that everybody gets a chance to win because we know that's not possible. That's not what happens. To me, is there a chance or a possibility that I could possibly win? That to me is what fairness is. And I often think about it in this way. My husband is 6 inches taller than I am. He has much broader shoulders than I do, and he can lift much heavier weights than I can. And about once a year, we have an opportunity, at best, once a year with weather and childcare and work schedules, to play tennis against each other. And we try to do that one time a year. I will tell you that I have never beaten him yet in tennis, but I do not go down without a fight. It is a close match, but I haven't won yet. I don't think it's unfair competition between the two of us. I think I have a chance to win, even though I haven't won yet. And I look forward to the day where you will hear me on this podcast tell you I finally beat him. It's been close, haven't made it there yet, but I would say that's fair competition. Compare that to if you asked me to run a race against him, and I don't care if it was short distance or long distance, my answer would be, I'm not even bothering. No, thank you. He will win every time. I have ran with him, not in competing, just ran with him. There is no way I can come close to beating him. And so for me, that's not really a fair competition. I don't have a chance to even come close. And then if we look at the two of us in swimming, what do you think I feel about that? I will tell you what I feel about competing against my husband in swimming. I'm happy to do it. He, on the other hand, isn't because there is an unfair advantage. I have the unfair advantage. If you put the two of us in a swimming pool to compete, I will win every single time, even though he's 6 inches taller than I am. Why? I have a better stroke. I love to swim, and I have swam a lot. He knows how to swim, but he doesn't like it at all. But regardless of the reasons that create the differences between our abilities to compete against each other in these different sports, when it comes to fairness, we are talking about that tennis match. It doesn't matter whether I've won or not. It matters that I feel like I have a chance. And in running and swimming, one of us feels like we're never going to have a chance. Why bother? That to me is what we're talking about in fairness, that there is a chance. And many people, when we talk about this, act like, oh, it's very simple. If there's high testosterone in the women's category, then it's not fair. They don't have a chance. But this calls the question that I asked last week that I'm going to ask again. is how much of an advantage is too much. Because if we look at an Olympian like Caster Semenya, who, if you don't know, she is a South African mid-distance runner. And she won gold in the Olympics for the 800 meter in 2012, in 2016, and she did her personal best in World Championship in 2018. And she was challenged because of her appearance of whether she was a woman or not. She was. She is a woman. And it turns out that she has XY chromosomes and higher levels of testosterone, in which case people said, completely unfair, completely unfair. She shouldn't be able to compete against women. It's an unfair advantage. So let me go back to the question of how much is too much of an unfair advantage? Because here's the thing. Caster Semenya's best time was 1:54.25 in the 800. That ranks her in the world records fourth. Fourth, there are 3 other runners that have run that faster than she has. The other part about it is that best time that she has ever had would not qualify her to compete in the men's category. The men's category in that year that she did her best time again was 1:54.26. To qualify to compete in the men's category, it had to be 1:46. 8 seconds difference. So let me ask you again. How much advantage is too much advantage? To me, even though she was winning, it sounds like her competitors had a chance, had a fighting chance. But yet we deemed it unfair because we knew of her chromosomes and we knew that she had elevated levels of testosterone. But yet she wasn't performing at what was categorized as the male times. And this is a thing, I mentioned it last week, I mentioned it again. We don't have a problem when men are outliers in their performance, when they excel way beyond other people. But we do have a problem when it's women, and we don't stop to ask, how much is too much? We don't stop to think about there is an evolution in time. There is an evolution in performance. If we look at the first time women could compete in the 800 meter, which was 1960, the winning time was 2:04, 2:04.3. The fastest time ever, which occurred in 1980, was 1:53.43. Almost 11 seconds faster in 20 years. And that wasn't even the world record. The world record didn't occur in the Olympics. It occurred in the World Championship. And it was 1:53.28. None of these done by Caster Semenya. Like I said, her time is fourth. These are like 1 and 2. But we see an evolution of time as we evolve as humans. And even the times that women are running the 800 meter now would have beaten the men in the 1920s. It does not beat them now, but in the 1920s, the winning times there are slower than our winning times now. There is an evolution that occurs as well, that when we're picking out people that we think, oh, unfair, unfair, we're not taking into account how much is unfair, how much evolution should there be. And even I would say Caster Semenya's times improved every time she competed. I don't think that's unusual for most athletes that are working and training, something we don't give a lot of these athletes credit for who are women. When we talk about Michael Phelps and other amazing athletes with amazing biological advantages, every article I read appropriately talked about their training as well and how they worked hard. But when we talk about the women, we don't talk about how hard they trained or how hard they worked. We just point at their chromosomes or we point at their hormone levels and say unfair. But to me, this is the problem. I don't see Caster Semenya's times as unfair advantages. I think we need to define what is an unfair advantage. What is it that we can't even have a shot at winning? I mean, if you look at the qualifying time for what we categorize as men, again, to me, a very generic title, but that qualifying time, all the women, our winning times cannot make those times, regardless of their testosterone levels or their chromosomes. So this brings me to the final one. The final problem that I see in looking at this is we lose sight of the level of competition we're discussing and the goal in that level of competition. We talk about sports as all sports, from Olympics to kindergarten rec department, all the same. And I question that. What is the goal? What is the goal of competition in the Olympics compared to the NCAA, compared to high school, compared to middle school, compared to elementary school, compared to the rec department, compared to club sports? What is the goal? When I think of a lot of these levels outside the elite levels, to me, the goal is to learn how to play a sport. It is health and movement. As healthcare providers, we're constantly encouraging people to move their bodies, and sports is a great opportunity. It's an opportunity to make friends and learn about teamwork and work ethic and having fun. And so, if these are the goals, why are we going to put limits that exclude people from having these benefits? What are we going to qualify as fair or unfair if these are our goals? A great example in my mind when I think about this is one of my children played club soccer, and he was in a tournament that was based on age and gender. And there was a team that was playing in this tournament that it was going around. They were getting beaten in every single game by double digits. If you don't know a lot about soccer, most soccer games don't go into the double digits. They were being beaten in the double digits. My son happened to play this team on the very last day of the tournament. And like every team before them, they beat this team in the double digits. Now, watching the team, first off, their goalie was probably the shortest person on the field. If you don't know much about soccer, goalies tend to be the tallest. So it's a disadvantage to be shorter. And watching this game, nobody was upset. Both teams never stopped playing with all of their heart. No one got downtrodden. They kept back over and over again, trying, cheering each other on, fighting for it. And it made me think about what the goal of that game was. The goal, it seemed to them, was to go out there and play, to give it everything they had, to work together as a team, to learn to cheer each other on, to face adversity, and to keep going. And they did it beautifully. They won at that one. But they lost the game. And this is what I'm talking about. We have to remember the goal of playing at the different levels. It may seem sometimes that two things against each other are hugely unfair. And we need, if we need to figure out how much unfair is unfair, first off, but we also need to focus on the goals of sports and competition. And so for me, this is a problem. We forget all that and we talk as if every athlete out there is going to be paid for their skills and that that's all that matters. When the truth of the matter is, only 2% of high school athletes will play in Division I NCAA sports. And out of those Division I athletes, do you know how many will become pro? 2%. 2% of them will become pro. Most of the athletes out there are out there for their physical health, for their mental health, for their joy. So, as I promised, let's talk about solutions. So, first, in the problems I mentioned, I think we need another system than men and women. I think there's something there, especially when we look at the running times. But we need to figure out what it is and use that rather than using this generic term that we're not really clear what the advantage is. Let's create a system like we do in many things. In the NCAA, we have Division I, Division II, Division III. It's a different level of athletes so that more people have the ability to compete. Create a system like that rather than using these generic things. Figure out what makes a difference and then use that. In regards to fairness, in order to figure this out, we have to decide, where does that line go that it becomes unfair? Where are we okay with there being a level of advantage, and at what point does it cross the line that it's like, no, in order to be able to compete, here it is. And finally, we need to remember the goals. We need to focus more on the goals of sports and movement and health and mental health, physical health when it comes to sports, to learning to play, to learning to spend time with people and enjoy and create relationships and friendships and learn teamwork. We need to remember that at every level. So, should transgender women be allowed to compete in women's sports? With the way the system is now, as problematic as it is, if I can't have my way and change the system and it has to stay the way it is now, then this is what I have to say. Transgender girls from college all the way down should be allowed to compete if they identify as women. They should be able to compete against women, period. I want as many people to go out there and be able to play for the reasons I have said. I know some of you are, oh, well, the men are going to, dress up as women and then compete, and then our women aren't going to be able to compete. I completely disagree with you. History does not support your assumption. That concern has been around since women were allowed in the Olympics. And we haven't seen it play out. Please, if there's data out there, show it to me. There is no data. And I cannot imagine people are going to transition in order to be able to compete against women's sports. So I don't have a problem. If you want to put women as a category, then it should be women, gender identity. Now, when we get into the elite level of sports, because we don't have a better system, as of right now, even though way more data needs to be had, I would say that testosterone levels should be under 10 nanomoles per liter in order to be able to compete in the women's category. And before you come at me, it should be lower. Women aren't that high. 10 nanomoles is on the low end of what we consider for males. And here's the problem. As I mentioned, research-wise, we don't have a lot of evidence of the elite athletes. So there's one study, and I will put the link in the show notes if you want to take a look at it, that looked at some elite athletes in certain sports, and there was a variety within a certain sex from sport to sport, a huge variety in the testosterone levels. One thing that wasn't tested is, how do testosterone levels in these elite athletes, how does that compare to performance? We don't know. But there's a huge variety from sport to sport. And so 10 is the lower level. The reason I don't agree in going down to 2.5, which I believe to be the higher limit of women's, again, I don't know a ton about elite athletes, but that's the lower limit women, is in between, to me, is a gray zone that we don't know about. And I have huge concerns with forcing people to suppress their testosterone beyond what we medically think should be done for the goals, the health goals that requires. So for gender dysphoria, there is a goal. For people who are intersex, they may not desire to suppress their testosterone. They may be just fine with their bodies as they are. So I will concede that there is some benefit to testosterone. I don't know exactly what level. And so I will say at the elite level, until more data, and we need to get more data, I would hold it at 10 nanomoles per liter. And I want to add this with the last comment I made, the paucity of data, the lack of data that we have. We are not going to get more data by saying transgender athletes can't compete. There are a lot we don't know. And I admit my system may not be perfect either because you can point out all the things we don't know. But I would rather, because of what I believe the goal of sports is, the benefit of sports, I would rather take an inclusive approach than an exclusive approach. I'd rather include more people to gain the benefits that want those benefits of competing in sports, and that will also allow us to get the data we need to decide where do we draw the lines, where do we create the categories. We're not going to be able to do better if we stick to what we have and start excluding people from competing. And to me, that goes against the whole goal of sports. Exclusion is the opposite to me. Have a great week.